In a small town called Harlan Falls, there was a house most people drove past without ever really looking at. An old woman lived there, quiet, unhurried, overlooked. She kept extra food on the stove, spare beds made up, and her door ready to open. When 3 little girls that nobody else wanted landed on her doorstep, she didn't make promises or speeches. She just said, "Sit down and eat." What happened over the next 2 decades would eventually bring that entire town to a stunned, shameful silence, because those 3 broken little girls grew up, and when they came back, nothing in Harlan Falls would ever be the same. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. There is a kind of person the world gets very good at ignoring. Not because they are invisible exactly, but because people stop looking, because nothing about them demands your attention, because they have never once asked you to notice them. In the small town of Harlan Falls, that person was Beatrice Johnson. Everyone knew her name. Most people just didn't think about it much. She lived on the far end of Caldwell Street in a house that had been old when she moved into it 30 years ago and had only gotten older since. The porch sagged on the left side. The paint, once pale yellow, had faded to something closer to dry grass. 2 shutters hung slightly crooked. There was a garden out front that she tended every morning, pressing seeds into dirt with steady, unhurried hands. Most people driving past on their way to work never looked twice at it. Inside, the house was warm in the way some homes are, not from the heating system, which was old and unreliable, but from something harder to name. The kind of warmth that comes from years of meals cooked and eaten, from voices filling rooms. There were photographs on almost every wall, different ages, different faces. Some were school portraits with uncertain smiles. Others were candid, a kid laughing at the kitchen table, a teenager caught mid-eye roll, a small child holding up a drawing like a trophy. None of those children lived there anymore. Beatrice, B, to the few who knew her well, was 68 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and hands that were always doing something. She moved through her house like someone who had long ago made peace with every corner of it. She had been here a long time. She had seen a lot. On most mornings she woke before 6, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table while the town outside was still quiet. Then she started cooking, not just for herself. She cooked in quantities that made no sense for a woman living alone. Big pots, extra portions in containers in the refrigerator. She kept the spare bedrooms clean and made up with fresh sheets. She kept a stack of children's books on the shelf by the hallway, even though no children had come in over 4 months. She kept herself ready. People in Harlan Falls had their opinions about this. The neighbors said she was a little odd. The women at the church said she was admirable, in that tone that means something closer to peculiar. The man at the hardware store called her the foster lady to his customers, not unkindly, just as a descriptor. It was not cruel. And it was simply the way that small communities categorize people they don't fully understand. She had fostered 22 children over the years, some for weeks, some for months, a few for longer. The photographs on her wall were the ones who had sent pictures back, the ones who remembered. She never talked about any of this unless someone asked directly, and people in Harlan Falls rarely asked directly. The town meeting that October was held at the community center. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. About 40 people had come out, which was considered a good turnout. Mayor Daniel Reeves sat at the front table with 2 council members. He was 53, with a solid handshake and the kind of easy smile that came from years of running for things. He was not a bad man. And he was the kind of man who was very good at making difficult things sound reasonable. What we're looking at, he said, is a 12% reduction across several social service allocations. This includes the county's foster family support fund. He spoke about cost per outcome. He spoke about scalable initiatives. A council member nodded steadily through all of it. Bea sat in the third to last row. She had her hands folded in her lap. Her face was calm. Her eyes were carrying something heavier, the particular weight of someone who has watched this exact conversation happen before. Who knows that the words cost per outcome are just the polite vocabulary of a world that has decided certain children are too complicated to be worth the trouble? She said nothing. She drove home in her old gray Buick, made herself a bowl of soup, and sat at the kitchen table and ate it quietly. She washed the bowl. She went to check that the spare rooms were still as she'd left them. They were. Beds made, curtains drawn, ready. 2 counties over, social worker Karen Mills was on her 4th cup of coffee and her 3rd hour of phone calls that were not going well. Karen was 38, methodical, sharp in the way people get when they've spent a decade doing work that is simultaneously important and under-resourced. She had short brown hair, sensible shoes, and a desk that looked like the aftermath of a small explosion. The file in front of her held 3 names: Claire Whitmore, age 14, Emily Carter, age 10, Lily Dawson, age 6. They were in separate temporary placements. They had no connection to each other by blood or prior history. But what they shared was this: every family Karen had contacted in the past 3 weeks had said no. Claire's file was the thickest. Words like oppositional and confrontational appeared throughout. She had been removed from her biological home 18 months ago. Her father, Jeffrey Whitmore, was a man with money and lawyers and the kind of social standing that made people reluctant to say anything directly bad about him. What had happened in that house was documented in language that was deliberately precise and deliberately restrained. Emotional abuse, isolation, control. Nothing that left marks on the outside. Emily's file was quieter, withdrawn, prone to anxiety. She had been raising herself, more or less, for most of her short life in a household where the adults were present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Family after family had returned her. Too much anxiety, they said. Too much baggage. We already have a lot on our plates. Lily was 6. Her file said almost nothing, which Karen knew from experience was often the most alarming kind. A few clinical notes, a few observations from a counselor. Does not speak in group settings. Attachment to transitional object, a worn stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. 3 girls. No placement willing to take even one of them, let alone all 3. It was her supervisor passing her desk late in the afternoon who said the name almost as an afterthought. Have you tried B. Johnson over in Harlan Falls? Karen had heard the name. She hadn't called. She had been saving it, the way you sometimes save the last option because using it means you've run out of other options. She's taken 3 at a time before, her supervisor said. She's been doing this a long time. Karen pulled up the file, read through it, saw the long record of placements, the steady documentation, notes from previous caseworkers who had used words like consistent and reliable and once simply remarkable. She picked up the phone. The woman who answered on the second ring had a voice that was unhurried. Karen explained the situation. All 3 girls. The history. The difficulty finding placement. When she finished, there was a brief pause. Do they need somewhere safe? Bea said. Yes, Karen said. That's the most accurate way to put it. All right, Bea said. Bring them. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early November in Karen's state-issued sedan. The sky was low and gray. Lily sat in the back with her rabbit pressed against her chest, watching the town pass in silence. Emily sat beside her, hands folded very precisely in her lap. Claire had insisted on the front seat. She read the same page of the same paperback 3 times without absorbing any of it. The front door opened before any of them had gotten out of the car. Bea came down the porch steps wearing a green apron over her cardigan. She stopped at the bottom and waited. She didn't wave enthusiastically. She didn't come to the car. She just stood there in the still afternoon and waited for them to come to her. Claire got out first, stood on the sidewalk, and looked at the house. Emily got out next, clutching her small backpack with both hands. Lily got out last, rabbit under one arm, and stood looking at the ground. "Come in," Bea said. "It's cold out." She turned and walked back up the steps without looking to see if they were following. After a moment, they followed. Inside, warmth hit them first. Genuine warmth from a kitchen that had been in use all afternoon, something on the stove that smelled like onions and herbs, and something richer underneath. Claire was already looking for the catch. She scanned every room she could see from the hallway, running the mental checklist that experience had given her. Where are the locks? What are the rules, really? Bea showed them their rooms. Emily and Lily would share 2 beds, a window looking out at the garden, a lamp on each nightstand. Claire's room was smaller, further down the hall, with a desk by the window and a faded green bedspread. Claire stood in the doorway and looked at it. "You can move the furniture if you want," Bea said from behind her. "It's your room." Claire said nothing. Back in the hallway, Bea looked at all 3 of them. "Dinner's at 6. Whether you come or not is up to you. Bathroom's there. If you need something and can't find it, you can ask me. I'll be in the kitchen." She went back down the hallway. No speech, no list of house rules, no attempt to hug anyone. At 6 o'clock, Bea set the table for 4 and placed a full bowl at the empty 4th seat. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still holding her backpack, and looked at the table. "Sit down if you like," Bea said, without looking up. "No pressure." Emily set her backpack by the door and sat. Lily appeared a minute later and settled in beside her, rabbit propped against the edge of the table. The 3 of them sat in silence, Bea eating calmly, Emily eating carefully, Lily eating slowly, with Rabbit watching over proceedings. Claire's chair stayed empty. Then, around 6:20, Claire came into the kitchen with her arms crossed. "I'm not hungry," she said. "All right," Bea said. "A beet. That smells okay, though." Bea stood, went to the pot, ladled soup into the 4th bowl, and set it at Claire's place without ceremony. She sat back down. Claire came to the table and stood for a moment longer than necessary. Then she sat. "You don't have to trust me," Bea said, to none of them and all of them at once. "Just eat." The soup was good. None of them said so. But Emily had 2 bowls, and when Lily dropped a piece of cornbread and looked instantly, reflexively frightened, bracing for a reaction, nothing happened. Bea simply handed her another piece. The kitchen was quiet around them. The November dark had come down outside. Something had begun, though none of them could have said exactly what. It took exactly 4 days for Claire to do something designed to end it. She had done this before, pushed early, before she got too settled, before any disappointment could land too hard. The fastest way to find out what someone was really like was to push until they showed you. She had learned this in houses where the showing had come quickly and badly. On the 4th morning, she came downstairs at 11 and announced she wasn't going to school. Bea was at the sink, scrubbing a pot. She didn't turn around. "You going to be home then?" she said. Not a question. "I'm not going," Claire said louder, jaw set, ready for the argument. "I heard you." Bea set the pot on the drying rack and turned around, drying her hands. She looked at Claire with the direct, unhurried look that Claire had already come to find unsettling. Nothing in it she could get traction on. No anger, no anxiety, just attention. You'll fall behind. I'm already behind. I know. Miss another day, you'll be further behind. So? Bea looked at her for a moment. So, she said, and hung up the dish towel and went back to the pot. That was it. No ultimatum, no escalating speech, no fight. Claire stood in the kitchen, fully prepared for a confrontation that had decided not to show up, and felt the particular frustration of someone who has thrown a punch and connected with air. She went to school. She would not have admitted this to anyone. The mornings were the hardest for Emily. She woke before her alarm, always. Some part of her nervous system convinced that sleeping too deeply was a risk she couldn't afford. She lay very still in the unfamiliar bed and did what she always did, listened to the house, mapped it, figured out where everyone was before she moved. Bea was always already awake. Emily could hear her downstairs, a cabinet door, water running, the soft clunk of the coffee pot being set back on the burner. The sounds were consistent. Every morning, the same sequence. For Emily, who had grown up in a house where the mornings were unpredictable, where the shape of a day depended entirely on things she couldn't control, this consistency was something she didn't know what to do with. She started getting up earlier just to hear it happen again, just to confirm that it would. Lily slept heavily beside her, Rabbit tucked under her chin. When she did wake, she lay quiet for a long while before moving, the same instinct Emily had, the same cautious mapping of surroundings before committing to the day. Emily recognized it without saying anything about it. They had established a wordless routine within the first week. Emily checked that Lily had her shoes before they left. Lily put Emily's things back exactly where she'd found them. They moved around each other the way people do when they have been surviving together for a long time. At school, they were quiet and largely unnoticed. Emily found her classes manageable. Claire was a different story. By the second week, the story of Claire Whitmore had gotten around most of the hallways. Information moved in small towns the way water moves in flat landscapes, quietly, broadly, finding every low point. A few kids were simply avoidant. A few were cruel in the indirect way of 12 and 13-year-olds, a comment not quite to her face, a group that shifted slightly when she sat nearby. Claire registered all of it and gave none of it the satisfaction of a reaction. What crossed the line was the afternoon in the cafeteria when those same kids decided Emily was a more interesting target. Emily was sitting alone at the end of a table. She preferred the end, so she only had to monitor one side, eating her sandwich in small, careful bites. A boy named Brandon came and sat across from her and started talking. He had figured out that cruelty disguised as humor was harder to call out. He said something about the foster system, something with a laugh at the end. Emily looked at her sandwich. She didn't respond. And Brandon said something else. Claire's tray came down on the table beside him like a starting pistol. She dropped into the seat next to Emily, directly across from Brandon, and looked at him with an expression that did something uncomfortable to his face. "Say it again," she said. Her voice was very even. "I was just—" "Say it again. To me." Brandon did not say it again. He left. His friends left with him. Claire picked up her tray and started eating like nothing had happened. Emily looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Claire said. A pause. "Thank you." "Don't worry about it." The school called at 3:15 with a version of events that had evolved considerably. Claire as the initiator, some shouting, the threat of a physical confrontation. The assistant principal, Mr. Garrett. "You had a lanyard holding 4 different cards and a pen." He clicked repeatedly when he was uncomfortable. Bea sat across from him, listened to his account, asked 2 clarifying questions: who had been at the table first and what had been said, and then asked to take Claire home. In the car, Bea was quiet for a minute. Then, "What were you protecting?" Claire looked out the side window. The afternoon sun threw long shadows across the school parking lot. "Emily," she said. Then, after a pause, "Some boy was saying things at her." "What kind of things?" Claire told her, plainly. Bea listened. She pulled out of the lot and drove in silence for a stretch. "You did the right thing," she said. "Could have done it quieter, but you did the right thing." Claire turned to look at her. This was not the response she had prepared for. She turned back to the window, the tight line of her jaw released by some small fraction. At dinner that night, Claire told Emily it wouldn't happen again. Emily nodded once. They didn't speak of it further. The nightmares came back to Emily in the third week. They weren't new. She'd had them since she was 7 or 8. Not clear images, just feelings, a heaviness, the specific helplessness of knowing something is wrong and having no way to stop it. She had always handled them alone. At her last placement, she'd woken another child on a bad night, and the woman who ran the house had come in and told her, not unkindly, that she needed to keep it down. So she had learned to stay quiet, stay still, handle it alone. She woke one night at around 2 in the morning, heart going fast, sheets twisted around her legs. She sat up slowly. But Lily was asleep, Rabbit rising and falling on her chest. The room was dark except for the thin line of light under the door, the hallway nightlight Bea kept on. Emily sat on the edge of her bed and breathed. The door opened very quietly. Bea stood in the doorway wearing a bathrobe and slippers, her silver hair loose. She didn't turn on the light. She came to the side of Emily's bed, sat on the edge of it, and set a glass of water on the nightstand. She didn't ask what the dream was about. She didn't ask if Emily was okay. She just sat there in the dark. And after a moment she reached over and rested her hand over Emily's where it was pressed flat against the mattress. Her hand was warm and dry and steady. Emily's breathing slowed. The shaking she hadn't even noticed was in her shoulders began gradually to ease. They sat like that for a while. Bea didn't speak. She didn't check her watch. Eventually, Emily lay back down. Bea pulled the sheet up over her, quietly, the way you do with someone very young or very tired. She set the glass of water on the nightstand where Emily could reach it. At the door, she paused. "You don't have to handle everything by yourself. Not in this house." She pulled the door to. Emily lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Something had cracked open, not wide, not dramatically, just a hairline fracture in a wall that had been solid for a very long time. She didn't know what to do with it yet, but it was there. Lily's attachment to Bea developed the way Lily did most things, without announcement, without clear, visible moments you could point to later. It happened in the accumulation of small things, the way Bea cooked, the way she moved through the house, the particular rhythm of her days, which was unlike anything Lily had passed through before, not frantic and unpredictable, not cold and scheduled, steady, quiet, the kind of thing that felt like it would still be there tomorrow. She started following Bea at a distance of about 6 feet, not obtrusively. She would appear in the doorway of whatever room Bea was in and find something to do near the wall. Arrange the crayons she had been given into color order, sit on the floor with Rabbit, and watch. Bea noticed. She said nothing about it. She just went about her tasks, and if she started narrating them softly, "I'm putting the onions in now. They need a few minutes before the garlic goes in," well, she had always liked a kitchen that wasn't completely silent. Lily watched. She listened. She began to learn the shape of Bea's days, the way you learn the movements of a careful, unhurried creature. The way Bea turned down the burner by feel without looking. The way she hummed when she was thinking. Lily's shoulders were lower than they had been. Her grip on Rabbit was less tight. It was a Tuesday evening in December, 5 weeks in, when Lily spoke. Bea was at the stove. The kitchen smelled like the chicken she had put in earlier. The small radio on the counter played something low, a gospel station she kept on in the evenings. Lily was at the kitchen table with her colored pencils arranged in a precise line beside her paper. Bea reached for the pepper above the stove, and the jar slipped. She caught it, but there was a small commotion, a clatter of her arm against the pot, and she muttered something under her breath. Lily looked up from her drawing. "Are we staying?" The words came out very quiet, but they were clear. Bea turned around. Lily was looking at her directly, which was not a small thing. She held Rabbit in one arm and looked at Bea with an expression that was trying hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. The real question underneath the words was plain. Is this real? Are you going to leave? Is this the kind of place that stays? Bea came to the table. She sat down across from Lily and set her hands flat on the surface. "As long as you need," she said. Lily looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at her drawing, picked up the dark blue pencil, and continued where she had left off. But she moved her chair almost imperceptibly a few inches closer to the table. Claire heard about the job offer by accident. She had come downstairs late for water, thinking the house was asleep. Bea was on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in that low voice she used when she didn't want to disturb anyone. Claire stopped in the hallway. She couldn't hear everything. She caught enough. Someone was offering Bea a position in another county, something real, something with a salary clearly better than what she had, the kind of opportunity a person would be a fool to pass up. She heard Bea say, calmly and without apparent difficulty, "I appreciate that, I do, but I've got responsibilities here that I can't step away from right now." A pause. "3 children," Bea said. "That's the reason. Thank you for calling." She hung up. Claire stood in the dark hallway and stared at the ceiling. Her heart was doing something inconvenient in her chest. Oh, she pressed her back against the wall and felt the thing she always tried not to feel, hope, the inconvenient, dangerous kind, move somewhere inside her. She went back upstairs. She lay in the dark and thought about the word responsibilities, the way Bea had said it, not like a burden, like a statement of fact, like the sky is blue or the stove is hot. She thought about it for a long time. By late December, all 3 of them were sitting at the dinner table together, not because they were hungry exactly, but because it had become the place they were. They weren't a family, not yet. They were something more cautious than that. 3 girls who had learned in different ways and at different costs that things ended, that people left, that houses that felt warm in November could be cold by February. But they were at the table. Bea was across from them, pouring more rice onto Claire's plate without asking because she'd seen her eyeing the serving spoon. The radio was on low. Lily had her crayons out, which Bea had never once asked her to put away. Emily had her hands wrapped around a mug of warm tea and was, for the first time that any of them could remember, not clutching anything out of habit. The walls were still there, thinner in some places, nearly untouched in others. There were things that hadn't been said, things that hadn't been faced yet. The world outside this kitchen was still the world it had always been, with its files and its hearings, and its people who had already made up their minds about who these girls were. But for this hour, in this kitchen, the soup was warm and the chairs had not pushed back. Bea watched the 3 of them and let herself feel, quietly and carefully, that this was real. It was something. It was enough for now. The stability they had built through December and into January was the kind that looked fragile from the outside, but felt from the inside like something real. It was built from small things, consistent dinners, the radio playing in the evenings, Lily's drawings accumulating on the refrigerator door, Claire doing her homework at the kitchen table without being asked twice. Not a perfect thing, but a real one. It lasted until the last week of January, when Jeffrey Whitmore's attorney called Karen Mills. Karen told Bea on a Tuesday morning, and Bea listened without interrupting, her coffee going cold in her hand. Jeffrey Whitmore was filing for renewed custody consideration. So his attorney had put together a motion arguing that his client's situation had materially changed. He had completed a voluntary family counseling program, he had a new domestic arrangement, and his attorney was prepared to argue that Claire's current placement, while temporary, lacked the financial and structural stability befitting a child of her background. "He's using the word background," Karen said. "I want you to know that." "I understand what he means by it," Bea said. She set the coffee down. She asked 3 questions: timeline, the court date, and whether Claire had been notified. The answers were 6 weeks, February 22nd, and not yet. "I'd like to tell her myself," Bea said. Karen agreed. She waited until after dinner. Lily was in the bedroom with her crayons. Emily was reading at the kitchen table, which she had recently started doing in the evenings instead of retreating upstairs, a small thing, but Bea had noticed it. Bea asked Emily if she'd give them a few minutes, and Emily looked at Bea's face and then at Claire's and nodded and took her book upstairs without a word. Bea sat down across from Claire. She told her plainly, no softening, no circling. She said what was happening, who had filed, and what the timeline was. She watched Claire's face go through several things in quick succession, something that looked like a door slamming shut, then a brief unguarded flash of fear, then the careful flatness that Claire wore like armor. "He doesn't want me back," Claire said. "He just doesn't want to lose." "I think that's probably right," Bea said. "So what happens?" "There's a hearing. Karen will be there." "I'll be there." "And if he wins?" Bea held her gaze. "I'm going to fight this, Claire. That's not a promise that I'll win, but I need you to know I'm going to fight it." Claire said nothing for a long time. Then she stood up and went upstairs, moving with that careful, controlled walk she used when she was holding something tightly inside. At the top of the stairs, she stopped. "He used to lock the study door," she said, not turning around. "When things got bad, he'd just disappear behind the door and act like nothing was happening outside it." A pause. "His lawyers are going to say I'm dramatic. Then we're going to need to be very specific," Bea said. Claire went to her room. Bea sat at the kitchen table alone for a while, her hands flat on the surface, thinking. 2 weeks later, Emily got a phone call from a woman named Diane Carter. I'm Emily's aunt, a woman she had met twice in her life, both times at gatherings where she had been largely ignored. Diane Carter now wanted to discuss Emily's living situation. She had, she said, been following Emily's case with concern. She had been thinking about her. She wanted to explore the possibility of family placement, Karen told Bea. Bea told Emily in the same direct, quiet way she had told Claire. Emily sat very still and said, "She doesn't know me." "I know," Bea said. "She's never—" Emily stopped. She started again. "There used to be this program. When you have a relative in the foster system, you can get payments from the state to support the placement." Her voice was very flat. "My mom told me about it once. I was 9. Bea looked at her. "Diane doesn't want me," Emily said. "She wants the check." "That's what Karen thinks too," Bea said. "And Karen's going to make sure the court understands what's actually being asked for here." Emily nodded slowly. She picked up her book from the table. She opened it to where she had been reading, but she did not read anything. She just sat there with it open in her hands. Lily's trouble announced itself differently, not with phone calls or legal filings, but with quiet, accumulating signs that something beneath the surface was shifting. She stopped sleeping through the night. Emily mentioned it to Bea first, that Lily was awake for long stretches, lying very still in the dark with her eyes open, not distressed exactly, just watching the ceiling. She started having difficulty at school, not behavioral trouble, She had always been quiet. But it was more that she seemed to be disappearing further into herself. Her teacher sent a note home saying that Lily had stopped participating in any group activity, even the ones she had previously engaged with. She still drew. If anything, she drew more. But Bea, looking at the drawings when Lily left them on the kitchen table, noticed a change. The earlier drawings had been simple: houses, flowers, a recurring image of a rabbit beside a tree. The newer ones were different. Darker colors, shapes that suggested enclosure, small figures that were difficult to interpret, but that sat heavily on the page. Bea spoke to the school counselor, a woman named Mrs. Hollis, who suggested Lily might benefit from more specialized support. Bea arranged an appointment with a child therapist in the next county over and drove her there herself. On the drive home, Lily sat in the back seat with Rabbit pressed to her chest and looked out the window. "You don't have to tell me anything," Bea said. "The doctor is for you." Very quietly, "I remember things." "I know," Bea said. "That's what the doctor is for. You don't have to carry them by yourself anymore." Lily looked at the back of Bea's head for a long moment. Then she turned back to the window. She held Rabbit a little less tightly than she had before. The pressure came from outside the house, too. In mid-February, a woman named Sandra Pruitt, who sat on the local Family Services Advisory Board and had strong opinions about most things, began making noise in the right circles about Bea's placement. 3 high-risk children, she said, a woman her age, with her resources. It was a lot to ask. It was. In Sandra's measured and carefully concerned phrasing, potentially not in the children's best interest. She did not use the word race. She did not need to. The people she was talking to understood her perfectly. Karen heard about it. She drove to Bea's house and sat at the kitchen table and told her straight. "It's not official yet," Karen said, "but there's going to be a review." "When?" "Probably before the hearing. Someone from the regional office is going to want to do a home assessment." Bea nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "What are they looking for?" "Honestly, they're looking for a reason?" Karen paused. "Which means we need to make sure there isn't one." "There isn't one," Bea said. "I know that," Karen said. "I just need the file to show it clearly." After Karen left, Bea sat in the kitchen and let herself feel. And for a few minutes, the thing she had been holding back since January, a quiet, specific anger. Not the hot kind that burns itself out quickly. The other kind, the kind that settles in low and steady and makes you move differently. She stood up. She went to the small desk in the corner of the living room and began to organize her papers. Documentation of every grocery purchase, every school pickup, every medical appointment, every receipt for clothing and school supplies. Proof of every single thing she had done, organized, dated, filed. She had played this game before. She knew how to make a file, tell the truth. It was the second week of February when Claire finally broke. She had been holding it together with a particular kind of controlled tension, the kind that people who have spent years learning to manage their own instability develop. She went to school. She did her work. She sat at dinner and was almost, on most evenings, something that looked like okay. But one night she came downstairs at nearly midnight and found Bea in the kitchen. Bea, who had been up late going through papers, who looked up when Claire appeared in the doorway wearing her oversized sweatshirt and a look that had given up on being controlled. "You can't actually stop him," Claire said. "He has more money than you. He has better lawyers. The judge is going to see this house and see you and see him, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out which way that goes." "Come sit down," Bea said. "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me the truth, because everyone else lies to me and tells me it's going to be fine, and then it's never fine, and I end up back." She stopped. Her voice had gotten unsteady in a way she clearly did not want it to be. "You're going to lose us. You know that, right? You'll try, and you'll lose, and then we'll be gone, and you'll just put new sheets on the beds and wait for the next ones." Bea set down the papers she was holding. She was quiet for a moment. "Sit down, Claire." "I just said—" "I heard you. Sit down anyway." Something in her voice made Claire cross the kitchen and pull out a chair and sit. She sat with her arms crossed, jaw set, ready to dismiss whatever was coming. Bea was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then she looked up. "I had a girl here once," she said. 12 years old. She'd been with me for 8 months. There was a hearing. Her grandmother came forward, said she wanted custody. The court sided with family." She paused. "I didn't fight hard enough. I thought the right arguments would be enough, that the record would speak for itself, that the judge would see what I saw." A pause. "It wasn't. She went. I spent a long time thinking about what I should have done differently." Claire stared at her. "I'm not telling you how this ends," Bea said. "I can't promise you that. What I can tell you is that I'm not going to make that same mistake. I'm not staying quiet. I'm not assuming the record speaks for itself. I'm going to fight every part of this, and I'm going to fight it loudly." She held Claire's gaze. "You asked me to tell you the truth. That's the truth." The kitchen was very quiet. The clock above the stove ticked. Claire uncrossed her arms. She set them flat on the table. She looked at Bea with an expression that had dropped most of its defense. Not all of it, because that was not something that happened in a single night, but enough that what was underneath was briefly visible. Fear. And underneath the fear, something more tentative than hope, but in that general direction. "Okay," she said. Her voice was quieter now. "Okay," Bea said. Claire went back to bed. Bea sat in the kitchen a while longer, the papers in front of her, and then she picked them back up and kept working. In the 3 weeks before the hearing, Bea moved differently through the world. She attended every meeting she was invited to, and several she was not. She sat in the county clerk's office and read the full documentation of Jeffrey Whitmore's family counseling program and found the gaps in it and wrote them down. She drove to the school and met with every one of the girls' teachers and asked them to write letters, not glowing endorsements, just factual accounts of what they had observed. Most agreed. 2 of them she hadn't even needed to ask. They offered. She filed the home assessment paperwork early and organized the house so that every room showed exactly what it was, not a showpiece, but a home. The girls' drawings on the refrigerator, Lily's crayons in the jar by the window, the 4 chairs at the kitchen table. She asked Karen to file supplemental documentation for the formal objection to Diane Carter's claim, and Karen had it ready within days. The girls watched all of this. They didn't talk about it much among themselves, but Bea could tell from the quality of the house's silences that they were aware, paying attention to every phone call. Every evening Bea spent at the desk with papers instead of watching television. One evening, Emily knocked on the open door of the living room and came in and sat in the chair beside the desk. She stayed for about 20 minutes, reading her book beside the pool of lamplight. Then she said good night and went upstairs. Bea watched her go. She turned back to the papers. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday at 9 in the morning. The night before, Bea made the kind of dinner she made for difficult days. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the green beans that Emily had recently admitted she liked. They sat at the table together. The radio was on low. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Claire said suddenly, breaking a long stretch of quiet, "I want you to know that this—" She gestured at the table, the kitchen, all of it. "This is the first place I've lived that felt like something I could trust." Emily looked up from her plate. Lily looked at Claire, then at Bea. Bea looked at all 3 of them. "You're going to be fine," she said. "Whatever happens, you are going to be fine. You know that, right? You are not the same girls you were in November." Lily set down her fork. She looked at Bea with that direct, considering look she had, the one that saw more than she ever said. "I don't want to go somewhere else," she said, simply, clearly. "I know," Bea said. "I don't want you to either." That was all any of them said. They finished dinner. They washed the dishes together, Claire washing, Emily drying, Lily stacking everything back in the right places, as though she had always known where they went. Bea stood in the doorway and watched the three of them work, and let herself feel what was there. They were afraid of losing her. She had not understood until that moment just how much that meant. The courthouse was a stone building downtown with cold marble floors and fluorescent lights set into a ceiling that felt too low. Karen met Bea in the lobby at 8:40, wearing her good coat and carrying a folder that was considerably thicker than the one she'd started with in November. They exchanged a look that contained a full conversation and walked up to the second floor together. Jeffrey Whitmore was already there in the hallway outside the courtroom in a suit that cost more than Bea's monthly grocery budget. He had an attorney on either side of him and a look of composed confidence that he had clearly practiced. He glanced at Bea when she stepped off the elevator, but he looked away again quickly. Claire's case was first on the docket. Jeffrey Whitmore's lead attorney, a man named Arthur Sloan, had brought documents, character references, and photographs of the renovated home in which his client intended to raise his daughter. He spoke about stability and continuity and the importance of a child being with her biological family. He was smooth and organized, speaking in the particular register of someone accustomed to rooms taking him seriously. Bea sat at the table across from him and listened to all of it. Her file sat in front of her. She kept her hands folded on top of it and let Arthur Sloan finish. When it was her turn, she opened the file. She was not a lawyer. She had not pretended to be one. What she had was documentation, specific, dated, and thorough. She walked through it in plain language. The school records, the teacher's letters, the medical appointments, the therapy sessions, the progression from November to now. She spoke about what Claire had been when she arrived. She did not use clinical language. She described, specifically and concretely, what she had seen. A girl who did not sit at the dinner table. A girl who expected to be punished for asking questions. A girl who had learned to be small and suspicious and alone. She did not say these things dramatically. She said them the way you describe things that are simply true. Arthur Sloan objected twice. The judge, a woman named Judge Patricia Harmon, who had short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, sustained neither objection. Karen testified second. She had been doing this for 11 years. She knew how to be specific on the stand, how to answer exactly what was asked without editorializing, and how to make the answers she gave carry the weight she intended. She talked about the 14 families who had said no. She talked about Bea's record, the placements, the outcomes, the documentation. She talked about the home visit she had conducted in December and then again in late January. In your professional assessment, the judge asked, has Ms. Johnson's home provided an appropriate and stable environment for these children? Not just appropriate, Karen said, genuinely beneficial. The change I've observed in all 3 girls in less than 3 months is the most significant I've seen in 11 years of casework. Arthur Sloan objected on grounds of characterization. Judge Harmon told him to sit down. The letters from the teachers were entered into the record, and the home assessment was entered into the record. A brief statement from Mrs. Hollis, Lily's school counselor, was entered into the record. Then Judge Harmon looked at Claire. You're 14, the judge said. You're old enough that I'm going to ask you directly. I want to hear from you. Claire had known this might happen. Karen had told her it was possible. She had not prepared a speech. She had decided, on the drive over that morning, that a speech was the wrong approach. that what she needed to say was simply what was true in the plainest words she had. She stood up. She looked at the judge, not at her father. "He's going to tell you he's changed," she said. "And maybe some things are different. But what happened in that house wasn't about one bad period. It was every day for years. The way he looked at me when I got something wrong, the way he talked about me to his colleagues like I wasn't in the room, the way he made me feel like I was a problem he was managing." She paused. "I don't want to go back to that, not because I'm being dramatic and not because Ms. Johnson has coached me to say this. I want to stay because for the first time in my life I feel like a person in my own home, and that matters more than what his lawyers are dressed in." The courtroom was quiet. Judge Harmon looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you, Claire," she said. Emily's case was heard next. Diane Carter's attorney presented her claim with considerably less polish than Arthur Sloan had. Diane herself sat in the gallery looking at her phone more than was advisable. When Emily was given a chance to speak, she stood up with her hands pressed flat against the front of her skirt, the posture of someone managing themselves very carefully, and said, in a voice that was quiet but did not waver, that Bea had taught her what it felt like to be safe. "I used to wake up every morning and listen to the whole house before I moved," she said, "to check if everything was okay. I didn't even know that was strange until I stopped doing it." A pause. "I stopped doing it last month." Diane Carter's attorney had very little to say after that. For Lily's portion, there was no biological party contesting placement. The concern was the broader home assessment, the question of whether Bea could appropriately support a child with Lily's emerging needs. Karen presented the therapy arrangement. Bea's attorney, a woman named Rosalind Webb, who worked out of an office 2 towns over and had agreed to take the case at a rate Karen had diplomatically described as reduced, walked through the evidence methodically. Lily sat beside Bea at the table. When the judge looked at her, Lily did not stand up to speak. She simply looked back at the judge with her quiet, steady gaze, and then she reached over and put her small hand into Bea's and held it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Judge Harmon looked at Lily's hand in Bea's. She made a note. She looked at the file. The ruling came at 2:15. Judge Harmon denied Jeffrey Whitmore's petition. The court found no material change in circumstances sufficient to warrant custody reassessment. And the documented record of Claire's current placement demonstrated a level of stability and progress that it was not in the child's best interest to disrupt. She included a note, rare in such rulings, commending the quality of documentation presented on behalf of the current guardian. Diane Carter's claim was similarly denied on grounds that the stated motivation for placement, established through financial record review that Karen had quietly requested, did not align with the statutory criteria for family placement. Permanent guardianship of all 3 girls was formally granted to Beatrice Johnson. Karen exhaled beside Bea with a long, slow breath. Bea sat very still for a moment. Then she folded her hands on the closed file and let the feeling come. Quietly, the way she let most things come. Relief was in there. So was exhaustion. And something that had no precise name but felt like the fulfillment of a thing you had refused to give up on finally arriving. She looked up at Claire, who was sitting on her other side. Claire was looking at her father's retreating back as Jeffrey Whitmore and his attorneys moved toward the exit. Her jaw was set. Then she looked at Bea, and the jaw released, and for just a moment her face was open in a way that Bea had only seen once or twice before. Young, unguarded, real. "We good?" Claire said. "We're good," Bea said. They drove home in the late afternoon light. Karen followed behind for a few blocks and then turned off toward her office, honking once as she went. Inside Bee's Buick, no one said much. Emily sat with her forehead almost touching the cold glass of the window, watching the town go past. Lily sat in the middle with Rabbit on her lap, turned slightly toward Bee. Claire, in the front seat, was quiet for most of the drive. Then, about 2 minutes from home, she said, "I want to learn how to cook that chicken thing." "The roast chicken?" "Yeah." "All right," Bee said. "This weekend." The Buick turned onto Caldwell Street. The house came into view, the sagging porch, the crooked shutters, the bare garden waiting for spring. It looked different than it had in November. Not because anything had changed, because they were looking at it differently. That evening, Bee made soup, nothing elaborate, because it had been a long day, and simple was what the evening called for. They ate at the kitchen table, all four of them, the radio on low. Lily had her crayons back out beside her plate. Emily was telling a story about something that had happened at school, a small story, told the way people tell stories when they feel at ease enough to bother. Claire ate without her arms crossed. It was not a dramatic evening. There was no ceremony. The guardianship papers were in Bee's bag, signed and official. Tomorrow the file would be updated, and life would continue the way life does. But tonight the four of them were at the table in the warm kitchen, and the thing that had been uncertain was now certain. Partway through dinner, Emily looked up and said, "Mama Bee." She said it the way you say something that you have been thinking about for a while and have finally decided to just say, not with great ceremony, just naturally, like it had always been the word that fit. Claire looked at her, then she looked at Bee, then she said, "Yeah," as though she were agreeing with something that had already been established. Lily looked at Bee and said very simply, "Mama Bee." Bee set down her spoon. She looked at the three of them. Outside on Caldwell Street, the evening was cold and quiet. Inside the kitchen, the stove was on and the radio was playing, and the soup was getting slightly cold because no one was in any hurry to finish. "All right," Bee said. She picked her spoon back up. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not quite. "Eat your soup before it gets cold." They ate. The house on Caldwell Street sat as it always had, unremarkable from the outside. But inside it, something had been decided. Not by a court, though the court had played its part. By three girls and a woman who had chosen each other, in midnight kitchens and cold courtrooms and quiet dinners. Who had, through all of it, stayed. They just knew what tonight was. Tonight, for the first time, this was home. Years have a way of moving differently once a house stops feeling temporary. The urgency drains out of the small things, the checking, the bracing, the waiting for the other shoe. What fills that space is quieter and harder to name. It is simply life, happening at its regular pace, in a home that has decided it is a home. The house on Caldwell Street changed gradually through those years. Not in the way of renovations or new furniture. Bee was not a woman who spent money on things that were working fine. It changed in the way that occupied spaces change. A second set of muddy boots by the door. A stack of law textbooks on the kitchen table that migrated from Claire's room when she complained the light in there was bad. A row of framed drawings along the upstairs hallway that Lily had made over the years, arranged in the order she had made them, which told a story if you knew how to read it. The girls grew up, not all at once and not without difficulty. That was not how growing worked, and all three of them had started from positions that made straightforward growing complicated. But they grew, year by year, season by season, in the incremental and sometimes barely perceptible way that change happens when it is real. Claire was 22 now, sharp-boned and direct in the way she had always been, but the directness had found direction. She was in her second year of law school, 2 hours away, commuting back to Harlan Falls on weekends with a shoulder bag that was always too heavy and a list of things she needed to look up that she kept in a running document on her phone. She studied at the kitchen table when she was home, the same table she had refused to come to that first November evening, and Bea brought her coffee without being asked, and the two of them sometimes sat across from each other in the early morning without talking, each doing their own work, comfortable in the shared silence. She had chosen family law. She had not talked much about why, but Bea understood. The world had not made it easy. She had gone to her first-year interviews at a firm downtown and sat across from a partner who had Googled her before the meeting and had questions, carefully worded, plausibly deniable, about her background. Her undergraduate transcript was excellent. Her LSAT score was in the top percentile. He still found reasons. She had come home from that interview quiet in a way that Bea recognized, and they had sat together at the kitchen table, and Claire had said nothing for a long time and then said, "I'm going to be very good at this." Not a question, not a reassurance, a decision. Bea had said, "I know." Emily had found her way into nursing. She was 20 now, enrolled in a clinical program at the regional hospital 40 minutes north, and the work suited her in ways that were immediately obvious to anyone who saw her do it. She had a quality that the best healthcare workers develop, the ability to be fully present with a person who is frightened without taking on the fear herself. To hold someone else's crisis steadily with both hands, and not let your own history leak into it. She had learned this, she sometimes thought, from Bea, from the way Bea had sat beside her bed at 2 a.m. without asking questions, the way she had made space without filling it with her own need to fix. Her own emotional landscape was more settled now than it had been, though not without its difficult seasons. Hospital training brought her close to things that resonated in old ways. Children in the pediatric ward who held their stuffed animals too tightly, who went still when adults raised their voices, who looked at every new face with the careful measuring assessment she remembered from her own eyes at 10. She never crossed a professional line with them, but she always lingered a few seconds longer than necessary, spoke a little more gently than required, left doors open slightly instead of fully closed, so the room never felt sealed. She called Bea on her breaks when she could, sometimes just to hear the sound of the kitchen in the background, pots, the radio, that particular quality of quiet that was different from any other quiet she had encountered. Lily was 16 now, which meant she was quiet in a different way than she had been at 6. The silence of a 6-year-old who doesn't speak is frightening. The silence of a 16-year-old who chooses not to is something else. It is a statement, a preference, a deliberate form of selfhood. Lily had figured out that she had one, and she was very specific about what she let into it. She drew and she wrote. She filled notebooks with both, dense, careful writing in one, drawings that ranged from tiny, intricate sketches to full-page images in the other. She did not show most of this to anyone. The notebooks stacked on her shelf in a row that was growing longer every few months. What she did show occasionally was remarkable enough that people who saw it often went quiet in a particular way, the way you go quiet when something surprises you into paying attention. Her English teacher had submitted one of her essays to a regional young writers program without telling her first. Lily had found out when the acceptance letter arrived at the house, and Bea had set it on the kitchen table without comment, just left it there when Lily came down for breakfast. Lily had picked it up, read it, set it back down. "She should have asked me first," she said. "You're right," Bea said. "She should have." A pause. "I'm still going to go." "I know," Bea said. Lily went. She came home 2 weeks later with a first-place ribbon she put in her desk drawer without mentioning it, and Bea did not mention it either, and that was exactly correct for both of them. She still had the rabbit. It sat on her bookshelf now, slightly lopsided, one ear bent from years of being held. She didn't carry it everywhere anymore, but she hadn't put it away, and she would not be putting it away. Bea had not told any of them about the fatigue. It had started in small ways, the kind of thing that is easy to attribute to getting older, to the long winters, to not sleeping as well as she once had. She moved a little slower getting up in the mornings. The grocery run that she had always done in one trip now sometimes needed to be broken into two. She sat down more often while cooking, which she had never done before. She told herself this was normal. She was 68 years old when the girls arrived, which meant she was somewhere past that now, which meant a certain amount of slowing down was simply to be expected. She did not go to the doctor. She was not, in her own assessment, a person who made a fuss. Claire noticed first because Claire noticed most things. She noticed the chair that had appeared by the stove. The way Bea paused at the top of the stairs some mornings. She brought it up once, directly, because directness was the only language she had. "You're not fine," she said. "Don't tell me you're fine." "I'm managing," Bea said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Bea agreed, "but it's the truth." Claire wanted to push. She had always wanted to push. It was the thing that made her good at what she was studying and sometimes difficult to live with. But she looked at Bea's face, and she recognized something in it. The look of a person who has decided how they want to handle their own business and would appreciate not being argued with about it. She didn't push, but she started paying closer attention. Each of them carried their own version of difficulty into those years, as people do. Claire's was visible and external, the resistance of institutions, the skepticism of people who had already decided what she was capable of before she sat down. She fought it with discipline and precision, building a record that could not be ignored, even by people who wanted to. Emily's was quieter and internal. Her training required her to stay present through things that stirred up older feelings, not constantly, not overwhelmingly, but persistently. She had a good therapist, a woman she had been seeing since her 3rd year with Bea. She was not, she had come to understand, someone who would ever be fully finished with that work. She had also come to understand that this was not a failure. It was just the shape of her life. Lily's was the most private. She processed things through the page, which meant that most of her difficulty happened in her notebooks before anyone else ever saw it. What came out into the world, the essays, the drawings, the careful observation she offered in conversation, was the part that had already been worked through. The rest stayed where she had put it, which was where she wanted it. They talked, the 3 of them. You in the way of siblings who have not been raised from birth together, but have arrived at something with the same weight. Late nights when they were all home at the same time, which happened less often now than it used to. The kitchen table after Bea had gone to bed, with the small overhead light on, and the house quiet around them. They did not have the shorthand of shared childhood memories, no inside jokes from elementary school, no old photographs of birthday parties, none of the accumulated texture that comes from growing up in the same house from the beginning. What they had instead was shared knowledge of each other's silences. Which ones meant something was wrong? Which ones were just thinking? Which ones were the comfortable kind that didn't need filling? That was its own kind of shorthand. It was enough. It was a Saturday afternoon in early spring when Claire found the papers. She had been looking for an old document, a reference letter from an undergraduate professor that she thought she'd filed somewhere in the house, and she had gone through the small cabinet in the living room where Bea kept her personal files. The reference letter was not there. What was there, tucked into a manila folder behind a folder of utility bills, was a set of financial records that stopped her. She sat on the floor with the folder and read through it. Bank statements, dates going back years. Specific regular withdrawals that she had to look at twice before she understood what she was looking at. Money going out not just for the household, groceries, utilities, school supplies, or the girls' medical appointments, but for things that had no obvious connection to the house. small regular payments to something labeled Community Foster Network. A larger withdrawal 3 years back labeled simply Legal. That one she recognized. Rosalind Webb's invoice. There were also records of things sold, a savings bond, a piece of jewelry listed in an estate document, a description, in B's careful handwriting, of a piano that had been sold to a buyer in the next county. B had owned a piano. Claire had not known that. There was no piano in the house. There had never been a piano in the house for as long as Claire had lived in it. She sat on the floor and looked at the papers for a long time. Then she put them back, carefully, exactly as she had found them, and closed the cabinet. She did not say anything to B that evening. She sat at the dinner table and ate, and she was quieter than usual, and when B glanced at her, once she held the look, and then looked away and picked up her fork. After dinner, she called Emily. "I need you to come home this weekend," she said. Emily could hear something in her voice. "What happened?" "Nothing yet," Claire said. "Just come home." Emily arrived on Friday evening. She came in through the kitchen door the way they all did. The front door was technically functional, but nobody used it, and found Claire at the kitchen table with her laptop open and an expression that was controlled in the way it got when she was managing something significant. B was in the living room watching television, which meant they had some time. Claire showed her the documents without preamble. She had photographed them carefully and made a spreadsheet of the key figures. Emily sat down and looked at the screen. She was quiet for a long time. "The piano," she said finally. "I know," Claire said. "How long was this going on?" "From what I can tell, the whole time, or close to it." Emily set the laptop on the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface. The old gesture, the one she still did when she was absorbing something difficult. She looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at Claire. "She never said a word," Emily said. "No," Claire said. "She wouldn't." They sat with that for a moment. "There's more," Claire said. She pulled up a second file. It had been Emily who found the medical records, though not intentionally. She had noticed in March that the cabinet in B's bedroom where she kept her personal items had a folder on top of it that hadn't been there before. B had taken it out for something and set it there and hadn't put it back. Emily had walked by the open door and seen it, and the instinct of someone in healthcare training had made her pause. She hadn't opened it that day. She had spent 3 days thinking about whether it was her business. Then she had opened it. The folder contained an appointment card for a specialist's office 2 towns over, dated 8 months ago. Behind it were 2 follow-up appointment cards. Behind those was a printed summary from the specialist, dense medical language that Emily could read without difficulty. She had stood in the doorway of B's room holding the papers and read them carefully. The way she had trained herself to read clinical documentation, which is to say without letting the words become anything other than information while you are still holding the page. She had put the folder back exactly where it was. She had sat on the floor of her own room for about 20 minutes. Then she had gotten up and washed her face and gone down to help with dinner because B was in the kitchen and Emily could hear her moving around in there, and the sound of it was more than Emily could take from a distance right now. She needed to be close to it. Now, sitting across from Claire in the kitchen on a Friday evening, she pulled up the photographs she had taken of the documents on her phone and turned the screen around. Claire read them. Her face did the thing it did when she was processing something she had not prepared for, a stillness that was different from her regular stillness, more internal, like the surface of water just before something moves beneath it. "How serious?" Claire said. "Serious enough that she's been seeing a specialist for 8 months without telling any of us," Emily said. "Serious enough that I know what the treatment timeline looks like, and she hasn't started it." "Why hasn't she started it?" Emily looked at her. Claire understood the answer before it was spoken. Because it costs money, Claire said. And because she didn't want us to worry, Emily said. Both things. Lily came home the next morning. They hadn't called her the night before. She had an early Saturday class for the writing program that they didn't want her to miss. Why, and there was nothing she could do before morning anyway. When she came in through the kitchen door at 11, she found both her sisters at the table and Bea notably absent. "Where's Mama Bea?" she said. "Church," Claire said. "She'll be back by 1. She looked at Lily. "Sit down." Lily sat. She looked at both their faces and said nothing, which was her way of asking. Claire told her what they had found: the financial records, the piano, years of savings redirected. She was specific and factual the way she always was when the facts were already doing more than enough work on their own. Lily listened without moving. When Claire finished, Lily looked at Emily. Emily turned her phone around and showed her the medical documents. Lily read them carefully. Then she set the phone down on the table and looked at her own hands. "She's been dealing with this alone," Lily said. It was not a question. "Yes," Emily said. Lily was quiet for a while. Outside, a car passed on Caldwell Street. The refrigerator hummed. On the door of the refrigerator, visible from the table, was the most recent drawing Lily had given Bea, a simple image of the house, the garden, 4 figures of different heights in the front yard, the maple tree in the corner, with its full summer leaves. "I've been writing about her for years," Lily said quietly, without knowing half of it. She picked up Emily's phone and looked at the documents again. "We need to do something," she said. "All 3 of us, using what we actually have." Claire nodded. "That's why I called you both home." They talked until Bea's car turned into the driveway at 1:05. The conversation covered things quickly and specifically, the way conversations do when the people having them are efficient thinkers who love someone. Claire laid out the legal angle. There were options around property protection, around formalizing the guardianship arrangements in ways that would secure the house against any future claims or financial instability. She had already started researching. She knew which questions to ask and who to ask them of. Emily laid out the medical angle. She knew the treatment options, knew the cost structure, knew what full coverage would require. She had connections now through her training, through the hospital network. Not powerful connections. She was 20 years old and still in school, but real ones, with people who could point her toward the right resources. Lily said less than the other 2, because she was still thinking. But she had brought one of her notebooks with her from her bag, and she had opened it and was writing in it while they talked, which the others had learned meant she was working something out. "There's a way to tell this story," she said at one point, without looking up from the notebook. "Not just to us, to people who have never set foot on Caldwell Street and have no idea this house exists." She paused, still writing, the pen moving in the quick scratching way it moved when she was working something out in real time. "There's been a story here for 30 years and nobody outside these walls has told it. That's the part I can do. That's what I've been practicing for without knowing it." They heard the key in the back door. While without any signal between them, none was needed, they closed the laptop and the notebook and turned toward the door with the expressions of people who have just been having an ordinary Saturday morning conversation. Bea came in carrying a foil-covered dish that someone at church had sent home with her. She looked at the 3 of them at the table. She looked at them for a moment too long. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Claire said. "How was church?" Bea looked at her. She looked at Emily. She looked at Lily. "Fine," she said slowly, and set the dish on the counter and kept half her attention on them while she put her coat away. She was not fooled. She was Bea. But she said nothing more about it, and they did not volunteer anything, and the afternoon moved forward. In the weeks that followed, each of them moved quietly in their separate directions, working on the piece of it that was theirs to work on. Claire called Rosalind Webb and had a conversation about property law and guardianship documentation. She called 2 of her law school professors. She spent evenings on her laptop in her room with the door nearly but not fully closed, researching with the particular focused intensity she brought to things that mattered. Emily reached out to a patient advocate she had met during a hospital rotation, a woman named Doris Hale, who had 20 years of experience navigating exactly this kind of situation and who did not waste time on preamble. Emily explained the circumstances in the precise, organized way her training had given her. Doris asked 4 questions. Within 2 weeks, they had identified a path, a combination of hospital assistance programs and a healthcare nonprofit that covered cases with B's specific profile. The coverage would be full. It would begin as soon as B agreed to start treatment. Getting B to agree to start treatment was not yet solved. B was a woman who had spent her entire life directing resources toward other people, and the idea of those resources being directed back at her was one she had not yet made peace with. That part they were working on together. Lily wrote. She wrote in a way she had never written before, not for herself, not for a class assignment, not for the quiet, private processing that her notebooks were usually for. She wrote with the intention of being read by people who did not yet know they needed to read it. She wrote the story of a house on Caldwell Street and the woman who had lived in it, who had kept her spare beds made and her pantry stocked and her door open for 30 years because she had decided that was what she was going to do, and she had never announced that decision to anyone. She wrote about 3 girls no one else had wanted. She wrote about soup at 6 o'clock and a stuffed rabbit on a bookshelf, and a late-night phone call that a 14-year-old had overheard from a dark hallway. She wrote about a woman who sold a piano and said nothing about it. She wrote about all of it in the voice she had spent years learning to use, specific and grounded and true, the kind of writing that does not reach for emotion because it does not need to, because the facts themselves are doing all the work. She did not show it to B. She did not show it to anyone yet. But the pages were accumulating, and they were good, and she knew it. B's health continued to be what it was. She moved through her days with the same steadiness she had always had, the same consistency of meals and routines and quiet presence, but there were more mornings now when she sat at the kitchen table longer than usual before standing up. More evenings when she fell asleep in the chair in the living room before 9. She had, without announcing it, stopped taking in new placements for the first time in years. The spare bedrooms were still made up, but the calls she used to make and receive about new children had gone quiet. None of the girls said anything about this directly to her. They saw it. They noted it in the way they noted everything about her, with the sharp, the loving attention of people who have lost enough to know how much attention costs when you have not paid it. One evening, Lily was at the kitchen table, just the 2 of them, B having her tea and Lily having brought her notebook down, when B said, without preamble, "You 3 are up to something." Lily looked up from her notebook. "I don't know what it is," B said, "but you're all moving differently. You think I can't tell." Lily looked at her. She considered briefly whether to say anything. Then she set down her pen. "We love you," Lily said. "That's what we're up to." B looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face, a complex thing, several things at once. She looked down at her tea. "I know that," she said quietly. "I know." Outside, the street was dark and quiet. The maple in the front yard had come back into its summer leaves, and they moved slightly against the streetlight. The house was warm. The table between them held 2 mugs and a notebook, and 30 years of photographs on the walls around them. That night, standing outside under the wide, darkening sky. All three of them were home at the same time, something that happened more rarely now that their lives had extended in different directions. They stood together on the porch without planning to. Claire had stepped out for air, Lily had followed, and Emily had appeared in the doorway and then come out and stood beside them. They didn't talk much. The evening did most of it. But there was a moment, brief, and none of them referenced it afterward, because it didn't need to be referenced, when all three of them were looking at the same house. The same lit kitchen window, the same familiar shadow of Bea moving inside, the same house that had stood on this street through all of it, through their arrivals and their fears and the court dates and the years, through Lily's first full sentence and Claire's first night without her arms crossed, and Emily's first morning when she did not lie still listening to the house before she dared to move. The understanding that passed between them needed no words. They had been given something extraordinary by a woman who had never once asked them to be grateful for it. They were going to give it back. The Harlan Falls Annual Community Appreciation Gathering had been running for 11 years. It was held every September in the parking lot behind the community center, now with folding tables and a rented tent and a podium dragged out for every occasion. The mayor gave remarks. A few local businesses were recognized. People ate from trays donated by the diner on Main Street and caught up with neighbors they hadn't spoken to since the last time something brought the town together. It was, by any honest measure, a modest event. But it was the largest regular gathering Harlan Falls produced, and that made it the right place. Bea had been invited, as she had been most years, in the same form letter that went to about 300 households. She had attended twice before, both times near the back, both times leaving before the last remarks. She had been mentioned once in 11 years, her name in a list of 6 volunteers, read quickly and without elaboration. This year she had received a slightly different invitation, a personal one hand-delivered by Karen Mills, who drove out to Caldwell Street on a Wednesday morning in late August and told Bea that there were people who very much hoped she would attend this year as a guest, as someone the town wanted to properly honor. Bea had looked at Karen with the particular look she gave things she found suspicious. "Who organized this?" she said. "The event committee," Karen said, which was true. Bea agreed, with the caution of someone who does not entirely trust that a thing is what it appears to be. She circled the date on the calendar, pinned by the refrigerator, and said nothing more about it. What the town did not know, and what Karen had not told Bea, was that the event committee had been quietly restructured. Claire had made the first call 6 weeks earlier. She had reached out to one of the committee members, a woman named Ruth Adler, who had known Bea for years and had, on more than one occasion, quietly expressed to Karen that she thought Bea deserved more recognition than she received. Ruth had listened to what Claire was proposing. She had said yes before Claire finished explaining it. From there, things had moved with the particular efficiency of people who know what they are doing and care about the outcome. Claire had worked the legal and logistical side, contacting the county records office, working with Rosalind Webb to finalize the property documentation she had been preparing for months. Emily had been in contact with the healthcare network, confirming the treatment arrangements and coordinating with Doris Hale. She had also reached out to several of the teachers who had written letters during the custody hearing years ago. 2 of them were still in Harlan Falls, and both had agreed immediately to come. Lily had been working on something she had not shown anyone. She had written and rewritten it over 3 months, evenings, early mornings, margins of other notebooks, then transferred it into a single clean document. She had contacted a small independent media outlet 2 counties over that covered human interest stories and sent them the piece. They responded within 48 hours. The story went up 3 weeks ago, quietly, without announcement. It had not stayed quiet. By the morning of the gathering, several larger outlets had picked it up, And the story of a woman named Beatrice Johnson on Caldwell Street in Harlan Falls had traveled considerably further than Harlan Falls. None of this had reached B. They had been very careful about that. The morning of the gathering was a Saturday in mid-September, the kind of morning that September in that part of the country does well. Cool and clear, with light that had the particular quality of the turning season, angled and golden, in a way that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Bea put on her good navy dress and her good shoes, and pinned her silver brooch to the collar the way she did for events that required it. She stood in front of the small mirror in the hallway and looked at herself for a moment with the expression of a woman who is attending something under mild protest. She came downstairs to find the kitchen empty. All 3 girls had been home that week, ostensibly visiting, which she had accepted at face value because she wanted to and because some things are easier when you don't pull the thread. She had heard them up late the night before, voices low in Claire's room, and she had stood in the hallway outside the door for a moment and then gone back to bed. Claire appeared from the kitchen doorway, dressed in a blazer and pressed trousers. Emily came down the stairs behind her in a dark green blouse. Lily came last, in a dress Bea had not seen before, her hair done carefully. Bea looked at all 3 of them. "This is a lot of outfit for a parking lot," she said. "We're coming with you," Claire said. Simple, settled. Bea looked at her, then at the other 2. "All right," she said. They drove to the community center in Claire's car, which was newer than Bea's Buick and had a working rear window. The parking lot was already filling when they arrived. Bea noted the tent, the tables, the podium, familiar as expected. She noted that there seemed to be more people than usual, though she attributed this to the nice weather. Karen was waiting near the entrance. She greeted Bea warmly, which was not unusual, and guided her toward a chair in the front section, which was unusual. Bea noted this. She sat down. The girls sat in a row to her right, and she noted that they were all watching the setup at the front with an attention that was slightly too focused for people who had come to an event they had no particular stake in. She said nothing about this. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Mayor Daniel Reeves opened the gathering at 11 o'clock. He was older now than he had been at that town meeting 11 years ago. Less hair, same smile, same easy relationship with a microphone. He welcomed everyone, made 2 jokes that landed adequately, and began his standard opening remarks about community and service and the particular character of Harlan Falls. He had reached the 3rd paragraph of his prepared remarks when he paused, looked at something on the podium, and said, "I understand we're going to do something a little different this year before we continue." A ripple of mild curiosity moved through the crowd. The large screen that had been set up behind the podium, which Bea had assumed was for the slideshow the event usually used to display sponsor logos, came on. What appeared was not sponsor logos. It was a photograph. Bea's house on Caldwell Street, taken on a winter morning. The garden bare, the shutters slightly crooked, a thin line of smoke from the chimney. It was an ordinary photograph of an ordinary house, and for a moment the crowd looked at it without particular reaction. Then Lily's voice came through the speakers. She had recorded the narration 3 weeks earlier in a single session in the spare bedroom at Caldwell Street on a morning when Bea was at the grocery store. Her voice was steady and unhurried and clear, and it had the quality that the best narration has, of someone speaking the truth without ornamentation, letting the truth be sufficient. She spoke about a house that most people drove past without looking at. She spoke about a woman who woke up before 6 every morning and made extra food and kept spare beds ready. Not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone was watching, but because she had decided this was what her life was for, and she had not wavered from that decision in 30 years. She spoke about 22 children. The crowd had gone very still. Photographs moved across the screen as she spoke. Photographs that Claire and Emily and Lily had spent weeks gathering, reaching out to people across the years who had passed through that house on Caldwell Street and had kept pictures. Some of them had sent photographs. Some of them had sent letters. 3 of them had sent video messages that Lily had woven into the narration at the right moments. Brief and specific and devastating in the particular way that simple, true things are when you finally hear them said out loud. The crowd was fully silent now. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for something to be over. The other kind. Bea sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap. She had stopped breathing normally somewhere around the 3rd photograph, a small girl at a kitchen table. A child she recognized, a child who had once sent that picture back with a note that Bea kept in the cabinet with her personal files. She had not expected to see it here. She had not expected any of this. She kept her face still. It cost her. When the narration ended, the screen went dark for a moment. Then Claire stood up from the row of seats beside Bea and walked to the podium. She stood at the microphone and looked out at the crowd. She was 22 years old, and she had spent those years becoming someone who knew how to stand in front of people who needed to hear things they hadn't yet decided to accept. She took a breath. "My name is Claire Whitmore," she said. 14 years ago, a social worker ran out of options and called a woman on Caldwell Street as a last resort. That woman said yes without hesitation. And then she made it her business to make sure that I and 2 other girls that nobody else wanted didn't just survive. She made sure we had something to come back to. She paused. "I'm a law student. I chose family law because I understand what happens to children when the system decides they're too complicated. I understand it personally. And I'm standing here today because I want this town to understand what one woman has been doing quietly and without recognition for 30 years, while most of you were driving past her house without looking at it." She stepped back from the podium. She looked at Emily. Emily came forward. She was quieter at the microphone than Claire. That was always going to be true. But her voice did not waver. She talked about the night Bea had sat beside her bed in the dark and held her hand without asking questions. She talked about how that one thing, that single act of unhurried, uncomplicated presence, had eventually become the model for the kind of care worker she was training to be. She talked about the children in the pediatric ward who held their stuffed animals too tightly, and what it meant to have been one of those children once, and what it meant to have had someone show her what safety felt like before she was asked to provide it for others. She said, "She didn't change my life. She gave me a life. Those are different things." She stepped back. Lily came forward. She was 16 years old, which meant that she was the youngest person who had stood at that podium in the 11 years the gathering had been running. She stood there for a moment without speaking, and the crowd waited, and the waiting did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like the pause before something true. "I didn't speak for a long time when I was a child," she said. "I had reasons for that. And then I came to a house on Caldwell Street, and there was a woman there who didn't try to fix my silence or fill it or explain it. She just made room for it. She let it exist without asking it to be different." She paused. "The first full sentence I ever said to her was, 'Are we staying?' I was 6 years old, and I was terrified of the answer." Another pause. She said, "As long as you need." And she meant it for the next 10 years, and she means it still. She looked directly at Bea. "I've been writing about you for years, without knowing the half of it," she said. "Now I know more, and I want this town to know it too. Because you changed our lives, Mama Bea. And you did it without ever asking us or anyone to notice." She stepped back from the podium. The crowd was very quiet. Then someone started clapping, and then someone else. And then the sound grew and grew, and by the time it reached full volume, it was not polite applause. It was the other kind. The kind that comes from a room full of people who have realized, collectively and uncomfortably, that they had been looking at something without seeing it for a very long time. Mayor Reeves stood at the back with his prepared remarks in his hand and did not attempt to use them. Bee sat in the front row with her hands still folded in her lap, and her face was very still, and her eyes were something she had stopped trying to manage. She had not moved from her chair. Around her, the crowd was still in that particular state that follows something unexpected, people turning to each other, murmuring, the collective processing of an audience that has been changed by what it just witnessed. A few people were crying openly. Several were not crying, but had the look of people who were deciding not to. The applause had faded into a kind of charged quiet, the way a sound continues to exist in a room after it has stopped. Bee sat in it. She had spent a lifetime learning how to sit in difficult things without moving, and she was doing that now, though the thing she was sitting in was not difficult in the way she was practiced at. It was something else, something she was less prepared for. Claire came first. She came back from the podium and stood in front of Bee, and for a moment they just looked at each other. The woman who had sat at a kitchen table at midnight and refused to stop fighting, and the girl who had stood in a doorway at 14 and looked for the catch in everything. Then Claire crouched down so she was at eye level and said, quietly, "No, so it was only for the two of them. We're not done yet." Claire straightened up and turned to the microphone. Not the podium this time. She stood in the open space in front of the crowd, the screen behind her, Bee visible and seated a few feet away. "There are a few things we'd like the town to know," she said. Her voice was composed and clear, the voice of someone who has organized what she is about to say and intends to say it exactly as she has organized it. The first concerns the house on Caldwell Street. She explained it in plain terms. The property documentation had been finalized. The house, which Bee had been renting for 17 years on a month-to-month arrangement from a landlord who had twice threatened to sell the building. A fact that Bee had never mentioned to anyone but that the financial records had revealed, now belonged to Beatrice Johnson outright. The mortgage had been cleared. The title was in her name. "She will never have to worry about losing that house again," Claire said. "She has worried about it for 17 years without telling a single person. That ends today." A sound moved through the crowd, not quite a reaction, not quite silence, something between them. Bee's hands, still folded in her lap, pressed together more tightly. Emily stepped forward next, standing beside Claire. "The second thing concerns Mama Bee's health," she said. The crowd was very quiet. "She has been managing a medical condition for the past several years without treatment and without telling any of us. Because she didn't want to be a burden and because the cost of care was something she was, for reasons that should be obvious by now, redirecting toward other things." She paused. "That is no longer the situation. Full medical coverage has been arranged. Her treatment begins next month. The best available care fully covered for as long as she needs it." She looked at Bee. "You spent years taking care of us," she said. "You don't get to do the other thing anymore. That's not negotiable." Something in the crowd shifted visibly. A collective exhale, perhaps, or the particular movement of people who are feeling something they did not expect to feel in a parking lot on a Saturday morning. Lily came forward then. She was carrying something, a book, slim and properly bound, and with a cover that was a photograph of the house on Caldwell Street in the evening light. She carried it to Bee and held it out. "This is the third thing," she said. Bee looked at it. She looked at Lily. "It's published," Lily said. "It came out last month. It's your story, all of it, from the beginning, as best as I could tell it. The real version, not the one where you're background noise." She paused. People have been reading it. More people than I expected. She stopped. She tried again. I've been writing since I was 6 years old because of you. Because you gave me a place where I could be quiet until I was ready to be loud. This is what I did with it. Bea took the book. She held it in both hands and looked at the cover. The house, the garden, the maple tree in the corner. Her hands were trembling slightly, which was not something anyone had ever seen from her before. She opened the first page. The dedication read, "For the woman who made room." The crowd had come fully alive by now. It was not a choreographed response. No one had planned this part. What happened was what happens when a room full of people reaches a shared understanding simultaneously and without instruction. People stood, not all at once, and not for any single moment, but gradually, and then broadly, until the standing was general, and the applause that accompanied it was the kind that takes over a space and fills every corner of it. Mayor Reeves moved through the crowd to the front, which took a moment because people were not parting for him the way they usually did. They were simply not focused on him, which was a new experience. When the applause had softened enough for words, he spoke. "I've been mayor of this town for 11 years, he said. He did not have his prepared remarks. He had set them down somewhere in the crowd. "I gave a speech at a budget meeting in this building 11 years ago about cost per outcome." He paused. "I would like to formally and publicly apologize for that speech." He looked at Bea directly. "I drove past your house every day on my way to work. I knew your name. I didn't know your life. I should have known your life." Another pause. "Harlan Falls is better because you chose to live here, Ms. Johnson. We are better because of you, and we should have told you that a long time ago." The crowd responded to this. It was the kind of response that a person receives when they have said the right thing at the right moment, which is rarer than it seems. The girls came to her together. They did not coordinate it. There was no signal, no arranged moment. Claire was standing to Bea's left, Emily to her right, and Lily was in front of her, and all three of them moved at roughly the same time, which made it feel less like a planned gesture and more like something that was simply inevitable. Bea stood up, and when she was standing, the three of them were around her. The embrace that followed was not a single clean thing. Arms finding places, adjustments, the specific warmth of people who know each other's bodies from years of proximity. Lily pressed her face into Bea's shoulder. Emily had one hand on Bea's back and one on Claire's arm. Claire held on in the direct, complete way she did everything. Bea put her arms around all of them. Her face, pressed briefly against the top of Lily's head, had stopped being still. All the composure she had held through the narration and the speeches and the book and the applause had come to its limit, and what was underneath it was simply what had always been underneath everything she did. Love, enormous and quiet and completely unperformed, the kind that does not require an audience and has no interest in one, and had been there from the first November evening when she had put a bowl of soup at an empty chair and said, "You don't have to trust me. Just eat." She had not expected to be seen like this. She had never planned for it. She had made her peace, long ago, with the likelihood that she would not be. And here, in a parking lot in September, surrounded by a town that was only now understanding what it had been ignoring for 30 years, she stood and held the three women who had come back for her and let herself be seen. The afternoon that followed was quieter. People approached throughout, some tentatively, some directly. Some said the right things. Some said imperfect things that were clearly sincere. Several people who had lived 2 streets over from Bea for years introduced themselves as though for the first time, which in every way that mattered they were. Karen Mills found Bea near the edge of the tent, temporarily separated from the girls, and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. "You knew," Bea said. "I knew enough," Karen said. "The rest was theirs. You could have warned me." "I thought you deserved to be surprised." A pause. Bea made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. She looked out at the crowd, Claire talking to someone with the purposeful energy she brought to every conversation, Emily listening carefully to an older woman who had taken her hands, Lily standing slightly apart, watching the whole scene with that steady, observing look that had been the first thing Bea understood about her all those years ago in a different November. "They grew up," Bea said. Quietly, not to Karen exactly, to herself or to the afternoon, or to nobody. "They did," Karen said. "You did that." Bea shook her head. "They did that." Karen looked at her. "You're both right," she said. "That's how it works." Late that afternoon, when the gathering had wound down and the tables were being folded and the tent was being disassembled, the four of them sat in the car in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving home. No one was in a hurry. The day had been large, and they needed a moment at the edge of it before going back to ordinary life. Bea had the book in her lap. She had been holding it since Lily gave it to her and had not set it down. "The dedication," she said. She did not finish the sentence. "I meant it," Lily said, from the back seat. "All of it." Claire was looking out the windshield. "You know what happens now, right?" she said. "You start treatment. No arguing, no redirecting. You let us take care of some things for a while." "Is that what I'm doing?" Bea said, with the particular mild tone she used when she was declining to argue, but had not conceded the point. "Yes," Emily said. "It is." A beat. "All right," Bea said. Claire started the car. The drive home on Caldwell Street took 4 minutes. And the house looked the same as it always had, the sagging porch, the crooked shutters, the garden going to its autumn state, everything as ordinary as it had ever been. But the title was in Bea's name now, and the treatment was arranged, and somewhere in a publication that was being read far beyond this town, the story of this house had finally been told in full. Bea got out of the car and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking at it. She had stood on this sidewalk thousands of times, in all the seasons, in all the weathers, in all the moods that 30 years can produce. She had stood here waiting for children to arrive. She had stood here watching them leave. She had stood here alone on enough evenings that she had stopped counting them, looking at the house that held all of it, the photographs on the walls, the spare beds. The extra food in the refrigerator, the chair by the stove, the 4 places at the kitchen table. The 3 women came and stood beside her. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Lily said, "Come on, it's cold." They went inside. Bea went to the kitchen out of pure habit, the way she always did, and the other 3 came with her. And somebody turned the radio on low, and the house settled around all 4 of them the way it did, the way it always had, the way it always would. The story did not end in that parking lot, with the applause and the standing crowd and the mayor's apology. It ended here, in this kitchen, where it had always lived. Where a woman had made room for 3 children the world had given up on, and those children had grown into women who came back and made room for her in return. Outside, and on a street that had never thought to look twice at this house, the September evening was coming down. The maple in the front yard had begun to turn. Inside, the light was on. How many people in your life have been quietly changing everything for you, and you've never once stopped to tell them? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories that will stay with you long after they're over.